Well, for those of you just joining us, good morning. We're going to start in about 2 minutes or so, letting some folks in to the Zoom meeting. We're glad you're here. Official introductions in just a few moments. Well, it's the top of the hour, so good morning again to those of you who have joined us. We may go ahead and take a moment here to just let anyone who is joining us in the next few minutes come on into our Zoom room. I'm Seth Stander, and I am the Community Aging Specialist for HHCI CARES, which is part of the Hope and Healing Center and Institute. CARES, by the way, is an acronym for Caregiving, Aging, Resilience, Ethics, and Spirituality. The director of HHCI CARES is Dr. Peggy Dettermeyer. Now, today, during the first of our four Aging with Grace sessions for the fall of 2023, I'm going to focus this morning on September 11th on healthcare rights and responsibilities. Hopefully, you are seeing the cover of this slide deck on your screen. Now, over the next 3 weeks following today's session on September 18th, we'll be addressing various legal considerations. We're going to skip a week and then reconvene on October 2nd, where we'll discuss understanding living options. And finally, on October 9th, we're going to discuss paying for aging. Now, each of these sessions is being recorded, so if you happen to be listening to this after its initial date, we're glad you are. It's a resource we hope you turn back to as you need over the next few weeks, months, and beyond. We also will make sure that every registrant has a copy of the slide deck for each of the sessions for which you register. So a reminder that if you have signed up for today's session, for example, but not for subsequent sessions, all you need to do is go to our website, hhci.org/events. And you will go ahead from there, see our calendar, and feel free to go ahead and register through Eventbrite, just as you did for today's session. So ultimately, in addition to community education, such as today's session and the subsequent sessions, Dr. Dettermeyer and I, through HHCI CARES, offer consulting with special emphases on the hopes and challenges of aging, on bioethics, on the hopes and challenges of caregiving, and on navigating the journey of grief. The Hope and Healing Center and Institute is a nonprofit. We are located on the campus of St. Martin's Episcopal Church, but we are a separate 501c3 dedicated to meeting the psychosocial and emotional needs of the entire community, thanks to some very generous underwriting and a robust philanthropy department. We are grateful to be offering this and just about all of our programming to you free of charge. So let's go ahead and enter the slides and discuss today's healthcare rights and responsibilities topic. First of all, I think it's important to begin with understanding what the traditional duties of medicine have been, and in many cases continue to be. They are to prevent disease, to restore functioning, to prolong life, to relieve suffering, to attend the dying. These concepts have been around for generations, and of course, they're well articulated in everything from, say, ancient scripture up through contemporary text. And as we have moved into contemporary times, healthcare accordingly has grown not just more robust, but also more complex. So, with that in mind, healthcare providers are now required to share detailed lists of patient rights and responsibilities to consumers. Now, those categories tend to cover what you see on your screen: financial considerations, treatment plans, information about your providers, policies and procedures about the institutions providing you care, and information about advanced directives that you have the right to provide and the responsibility to show to those who are tasked with your care. We're going to touch on each one of these today, but I think it's important to note that while we, the consumer, have a detailed list of rights and responsibilities that healthcare providers are obliged to provide us with, only a small percentage of us, maybe 10, 15% or so, take the time to read these fully. Now, that's not a judgment, it's merely an observation. It's, to a certain extent, akin to when you go ahead and you download an app onto your smart device and you skip right past the end user licensing agreement to just check I agree so you can download the app and get on with your day. This is a little different. And this is why we're, in today's topic, giving you a better understanding, I hope, of the overarching categories of rights and responsibilities so that you can take the time to read in greater detail just what it is that healthcare providers are responsible for providing to you and what you in turn are responsible for providing to them. So let's talk first and foremost about financial rights and responsibilities. We'll discuss it first because in one way it's the simplest category, but it's not so simple when it gets expensive. Now, if you happen to have robust health insurance, terrific. It's a matter then with health insurance of what rate your health insurance provider has agreed to hand over to your healthcare provider. And whatever is left over is yours to cover. We know this in terms of copays, in terms of 80-20 or 60-40, in terms of in-network, out-of-network coverages and responsibilities for payment. It's amazing what health insurance can do to mitigate the cost of expected or unexpected healthcare needs. Having said that, it is hardly perfect and it is not a complete safety net. There are many of us, some of you may be in this category, who are either live with us or listening or watching today's recording without health insurance currently. Now, if that is the case, you have the right to have an explanation of your charges. You have a right regardless of whether you have health insurance or not. But ultimately, what you also have the right to receive is the specific list of prices that the provider is charging you for various services. Now, you have a responsibility for covering whatever you use. I will say this. If you don't have robust health insurance, or if you find yourself out of network, or if you don't have health insurance at all, and you find yourself in a position where you are in need of expected or more likely unexpected health care, I encourage you by all means to negotiate. Be upfront about your ability to self-pay your responsibility, whether it is part or all of that upcoming healthcare bill and to scrutinize the itemized charges as you do so, offering an alternative amount ultimately. Because remember, providers are going to prefer to receive a partial payment versus no payment at all. Much more on each one of these topics could be said, but this is really just a taste of the overarching categories. But if you take nothing away from this category, remember that negotiation with your provider is certainly your right, and I would argue your responsibility, especially when scrutinizing to ensure that the charges that you have been handed are accurate and timely. Now, talking about another right and responsibility, that is when it comes to the treatment plan, following it or not following it. You have the right to follow your physician or other caregiver's treatment plan. You have the right to follow it in part. You have the right to follow it not at all. Now, the provider has a responsibility to explain to you in detail what they plan to do to you and what the benefits and the potential complications of treatment may be. You have the right to ask questions and to accept, or again, to decline some or all of what the provider is proposing. You also have the right to have follow-up care with the provider. That's continuity of care. Equal access for all when it comes to healthcare is, as we know, a moving target, a work in progress, but a right that every one of us should speak up for. And as you look at the list of different treatment plan items on this screen, I want you to take a careful note of the final one, which is informed consent. If you don't grant informed consent to a provider, ultimately, what that provider may do to you may be considered as far as criminal battery, because again, your right to receive care or not receive care, in part or in whole, is paramount. We use the overarching category of information to go ahead and to help us understand a little bit more about the people who are providing us with timely care. Again, whether it's scheduled or unscheduled care. We have the right to know the identity of our caregivers. We have the right to know their names, their professional credentials. We also have the right to know in whatever written format we can easily read or understand, or if reading is a challenge to us, something that can be communicated to us in the most appropriate way for our different abilities to understand our patient rights. Now, if you need interpreter services, and not necessarily something in Braille or something that can be read to you aloud in a language you already understand, interpreter services are another piece of this particular process, not just in terms of getting information about your patient rights, not just about knowing the identity of your caregivers. You're entitled to translation services or to alternate communication services throughout the entire process of receiving healthcare, as well as understanding what follow-up may be needed upon discharge from whatever institution you find yourself in receiving healthcare. Now, part of the essentials that you should take with you upon discharge from your facility, wherever that happens to be, is being able to access your medical records. Now, there are healthcare institutions who will charge you for copies of the medical record that was created during your stay. So, pro tip, if you will, I suggest if you have a primary care physician to ask that primary care physician, since they are going to be involved in continuity of care post-discharge, to obtain those records and add them to the records they currently hold in their medical office. Also, a reminder that online patient portals, for the most part, there are still some cases in which charges will apply, but for the most part, summaries of your records, if not records in detail, should be available to you at minimal to no cost. I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the item above accessing medical records, which is to receive information about your treatment options. This also goes hand in hand with having your primary care physician, or on the slides, as it says, family member physician notified that you are receiving scheduled or unscheduled care in an institution, because much of the time, there is more than one way to treat a condition. And sometimes, let's say prescriptions, use those as an example, you're going to find prescription options for a condition that vary widely in terms of out-of-pocket expense, but may end up helping you in similar ways. It may also be the case that by working with your primary care physician post-discharge, you are ultimately making sure that there are no contraindications for the medication you may have received while in, say, an urgent care or a hospital versus what regular medications, if any, you may be on. One final piece, and this pertains particularly to hospital care. It's entirely possible that your primary care physician may have privileges in the hospital that's treating you. That would mean, in addition to being able to see you and to participate as part of the interdisciplinary team caring for you, they would have real-time access to your records and not just be accessing them after the fact. If that occurs, that is, of course, ideal. If that doesn't occur, then, of course, as I said before, making sure that your primary care physician accesses your detailed records so that they can go over them with you later saves time and expense on your end and ensures continuity of care as well. Going into the next category of policies and procedures. Here I'm going to start with the responsibility because it's right there in the center of this image that you see on your screen. Follow the rules. Be considerate. Ultimately, we all are having rotten days if we find ourselves, whether scheduled or unscheduled, in a hospital, in an urgent care, and beyond. Ultimately, do your very best to follow the rules and procedures that you have been given and to offer some grace to the people who are there tasked with your care. It's going to go a long way towards being able to truly partner with them when it comes to understanding your options and exercising those options based on the goals of care that ideally you're working on together. Now let's talk a little bit about the rights that you have when it comes to the policies and procedures of healthcare institutions. You have the right to privacy, first and foremost. Ultimately, this means that only information that you, or if there is a proxy speaking for you, permits to be released can be released. Very often, this impacts when it comes to spiritual care visits. If those of you who are affiliated with faith communities ask yourself after a multi-day stay, why didn't my clergy come visit me? Well, you may have to go back and review whether or not you gave permission for them to be aware that you were in the hospital in the first place. The institution is unlikely to be the reporting institution that you are being hospitalized. Usually, it's the patient themselves, or again, their proxy, their closest loved ones, be they family or friends, who are going to go ahead and inform outside parties like clergy that you are in the hospital. But unless you specifically give permission, and not just to clergy, let's talk about members of your faith community, members of your professional community, your neighbors, your friends, even family members. If you have not gone ahead and given consent for information about why you are in the hospital or that you are in the hospital, if you haven't gone ahead and provided that permission, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which has been in place since 1996, is what prevents institutions from sharing anything outside your or your proxy's permission to do so. So when it comes to knowing the policies and procedures, right next to the little bulb here that have privacy, think about that for a second and just recognize that the policies and procedures may be not only we're going to follow federal law and protect your privacy, but the way that privacy is protected is that the hospital will not be the first source of information for outside parties. You have to specifically request it if perhaps you are away from family, friends, community, and need help notifying them that you have been hospitalized outside of your home area. You absolutely have the freedom to be free from abuse. You have the freedom to be free from restraints. There are some notable exceptions that have very specific parameters, including how long you can be restrained if you prove to be a harm to yourself or others. And this is where the policies and procedures, not only of, say, the hospital, but also an understanding of the rules and regulations, both federal and state, when it comes to the use of restraints is useful. Now, we're not going to expect you having a terrible day if you have an unscheduled visit to the hospital to be an expert on those. But there are people in the hospital who absolutely are. Patient advocates, risk management specialists, let alone the clinical staff, chaplains. These are all individuals who will be able to help you understand if you need help understanding the policies and procedures, as well as the specific rules on such things as restraints and the very limited window under which restraints can be utilized. This will be an area where they will prove to be helpful as your eyes, ears, and information sources. Now, that's an extreme. So let's think more in terms of the other important elements of this. Maintaining your confidentiality. Now, that is a little different than having privacy in the sense that ultimately we're talking about yes, you've given, say, permission to let people know that you are in the hospital. What you have not done is gone ahead and waived doctor-patient privilege. And so your condition is only known to you unless you specifically indicate agents or other individuals who may become aware of it by your treating clinical staff. You are always free to share confidential issues, but your clinical staff is bound from doing so unless they receive specific permission to do so. Preserving your self-image and engaging in ethical issues are the last two bulbs that are in this particular slide. And what they really have to do is not just preserving your dignity, but also making sure that should you have, or should any loved one speaking on your behalf have questions about not just the efficacy of a particular treatment, but whether or not it is in keeping with what is reasonable in terms of standards of care, and also in keeping with your particular wishes based on the medical condition you find yourself experiencing, that's where an informal or even a formal ethics consult may prove useful in order to help advise all parties that have a question about how your care should be considered moving forward, whether it is truly aggressive, whether it is primarily comfort-based, or some mixture in the gray area in between. Now, this leads us into the section of advanced directives, where we're going to spend a little bit more time today. You have the right to an advance directive, and I'll explain a little more about the history behind that in just a moment. But beyond that, you also have the responsibility to make sure that your advance directives are provided to your healthcare provider. I realize that, again, you may find yourself in an unexpected situation and not necessarily have the exact documents that you need at the moment that you have become in need of hospitalization. But doing your very best, or depending on your condition, having your healthcare proxy provide advance directive information to the clinicians tasked with your care is crucial. It's also your right, as I said before, to draft them in the first place and to make sure that they are clearly read and understood by the clinical staff that is working with you. So flashback to 1976, to the story of Karen Ann Quinlan, a story some of you may know very well and you may have lived through, and others may only have a passing knowledge or no knowledge of it. But the family of Karen Ann Quinlan went through a horrible tragedy and started a chain of events that led to us being able to draft and provide advance directives to healthcare institutions. Karen's parents went ahead and took the hospital that was caring for her. And I say caring as opposed to treating, because Karen, once she entered the hospital in a persistent vegetative state, she never really left that persistent vegetative state. They took the hospital to court because ultimately they did not see that Karen's quality of life was going to improve and wanted her to be removed from the service of the ventilator that was helping to keep her alive. The hospital had refused, which is why they went to court in order to direct the hospital to remove the ventilator and to allow natural death to occur. The court did rule in the parents' favor, and the hospital elected, because the method of removing the ventilator was left unclear, to choose a slow weaning process. As a result, it turned out that Karen, or Karen's body, survived. And Karen's body remained in a persistent vegetative state for 9 more years, not in the hospital, but in a nursing home. And the reason for this, because this is still uncharted territory in 1976, the question of artificial nutrition and hydration was not addressed in the court procedures. Karen's parents didn't know that this needed to be included. And since ultimately it wasn't, there wasn't much to be done. So in the years following Karen's discharge from the hospital, her body's continued existence in a nursing home, and ultimately her demise 9 years after this court case was decided, there was a rise in detailed advance directives to provide guidance when tragedies might befall us. Ultimately, the goal here is to make sure that wherever you are, your specific wishes regarding aggressive versus comfort care and all points in between is clearly understood and also honored by the healthcare institution which is treating you. Federal legislation passed in 1991 ultimately directed all 50 states to have some type of law with regard to the creation and execution of advance directives. In addition to that, all of the states should generally recognize and honor the content of advance directive forms that originate from other states. Now, there is an exception. Some states have on their books laws that permit medical assistance in dying. Most states still do not permit that at this time, may never permit it depending on the state. So ultimately, if it's not a part of that state's legal umbrella, it is not something that needs to be honored. But outside of those situations, you can expect that everyone, wherever you go, with an advance directive is going to have a sense of who you are, what you like to do, what you like to have control over, what are your goals, not just in terms of short-term, but long-term, and that includes based on your physical as well as mental condition, and what ultimately are you hoping for when it comes to not just your quantity of days, but your quality of days. Advance directives empower us to exercise these goals. The language of advance directives may look a little bit different, but when you think about that language and you look at it in detail, as I hope you will look at policies, procedures, healthcare rights provided to you by hospitals and other healthcare institutions in greater detail, I think you're going to begin to see that these are the questions that advance directives begin to answer based on the situation you may find yourself in, medically speaking. So let's remind ourselves of the potential goals of care. That's going to help us understand how we craft and why we include or don't include certain elements of advanced care, advanced directive planning language. When we talk about the potential goals of care, and you can see on the screen here, curing disease, avoiding premature death, maintaining or improving function, prolonging life, relieving suffering, maintaining quality of life, staying in control. Now remember, no one who is listening and watching today or at your convenience at some point in the future to this presentation is immortal. All of us are mortal, of course, but none of us, I imagine, wants to die before living as full a life as possible. And none of us, I imagine, wants to live in a state of, well, perpetual distress, even misery. So again, the language of advance directives, when you look deeper at the specifics, takes these factors as well as the other goals of the previous slide in mind. It also ideally covers multiple goals of care, which is to say, there are goals of care that often apply simultaneously. There are some that may appear or actually be contradictory to one another. And ultimately, there are some that may take priority over others. Now, I'll use the example of second and third bullet points, multiple goals of care that may be contradictory, or multiple goals of care where some may take priority over others, by thinking about, say, treatment for cancer. Chemotherapy and or radiation may make you feel rather terrible. But if said chemotherapy and radiation eradicate the cancer, which would otherwise shorten your days, we accept the contradiction and we prioritize the life-saving care while also recognizing that there is another goal of care in that particular point, which is palliative care. Palliative care is the umbrella category under which we take on symptom management. Symptom management in this case would be the side effects that stem from aggressive cancer treatment in whatever form it takes. We live in an amazing environment of care in contemporary days. We have the ability, thanks to medical specializations, thanks to consistently high quality surgery skills, anesthesiology skills, the skills and the equipment available in intensive care units to preserve and prolong life. One example of this could be organ failure. If your kidneys ultimately give out, there is dialysis. There may also possibly be transplants. If you are facing a situation where you are in not necessarily a persistent vegetative state, but you are being sedated in order to go ahead and to improve your body's chance of recovery from whatever injury or malady you're facing, artificial nutrition and hydration will continue to sustain you as your body heals. We have the ability to go ahead and to provide heart and lung assists, not just surgically, but also as we continue to recover our strength after the most critical injuries or maladies we may encounter. And ultimately, with all of this comes new ethical quandaries. For example, do we go ahead and provide in an equitable fashion all of the different technologies that are available to people in order to prolong and preserve life? Now, dialysis is readily covered by Medicaid when people lack health insurance. So that's a great example of where we have done our best to go ahead and make such life-saving technology available to all. But what about people for whom, say, traditional cancer treatment is ineffective? Only some will get into a clinical trial, and only some will receive the actual medication, as opposed to a placebo. In order to participate in that trial, you have essentially consented to being a research subject. There are ethical quandaries about such life-saving procedures, not just potentially your own, but as we look to the future for others who may experience in the future a similar malady, a similar injury. Ultimately, artificial nutrition and hydration, as well as they work, may ultimately have limits when it comes to our quantity of days versus our quality of days, which is to say, as the body, as we all are mortals, some occasions we will find ourselves in a situation where multiple organ failure is occurring and death is imminent. Discontinuing artificial nutrition and hydration so as not to put strain and distress on the body, it can seem as though we are doing something inappropriate, even cruel, if we don't understand the reason why at this latter stage of a person's life, artificial nutrition and hydration will not help, but will actually hinder symptom management that leads to as peaceful a death as possible. Because again, we are all mortal. So with all of that in mind, I think it's important for us to understand some critical terminology as you go into, again, scheduled or unscheduled, a healthcare institution. An intensive care unit, well, I mentioned that that's an amazing technological advance, not just in terms of the equipment available, but the who are tasked with care for people who qualify to reside for a time in the intensive care unit. Now, I hate to say it, but it is not a magic cure for those who are the most fragile among us in need of medical care. There's really, just from the very start, a 10% likelihood of death, regardless of what treatment is given, because of the fragility of a patient who winds up there. But the skills of the staff and the ratio when it comes to patient and nurse, usually it's anywhere from 2-to-1 to 3-to-1. And the more robust treatment that's available may, in fact, help you graduate out of that unit into more intermediate care and ultimately discharge successfully from the hospital. CPR. CPR, for those who are younger and more robust, it is absolutely worth trying, and we have seen dramatic examples in our own lives and through witnessing the most public of tragedies averted thanks to timely intervention. Think of the case last year of Buffalo Bills football player Damar Hamlin, and how timely CPR allowed him to come back from the brink of death and to make ultimately what appears to be a full recovery from what he had unfortunately experienced, a cardiac event in the middle of. Having said that, it's life-saving treatment for some. It is not necessarily going to go ahead and be effective on others. The more fragile you are, the less likely it is that CPR is going to be effective. And so an important discussion to have is, at what point physically are you willing to have your body ravaged by compressions in order to go ahead and to try and cheat death at that particular moment? Different people will answer in different ways, but recognize that when CPR is done right, it causes physical injury. You have to decide whether or not that is worth the price for resuscitation, depending on age and physical condition. Now, some people may say it's not. And for them, we have what is called a do not resuscitate order. Now, a do not resuscitate order has both in-hospital and out-of-hospital formats, and that means no chest compressions, no cardiac drugs, no defibrillation, no breathing tubes. So we're not just talking about the physical compression, we're talking about anything that could be used to go ahead and to try and forestall death. Again, a decision that individuals need to make based on their perception of what a good quality of life is after an adverse event occurs. Some will go ahead and take it to different levels, which is why you see on here as well, do not intubate, which means, yes, do the chest compressions, do the cardiac drugs and defibrillation, but no breathing tubes. And some will go ahead and say, allow natural death, which is to say only comfort measures, nothing that prolongs the dying process, but use those comfort measures for as effective symptom management where possible. Each one of these, I should say, these are all things that would be part of your advanced directives. For example, a directive to physicians and family or surrogates. That is the legal term of art for what we colloquially refer to as a living will, who will speak for you when you can't. And that includes your doctor when that living will is active. It shares your preferences again when it comes to quantity versus quality of life. And that is the reason why we have here a few other categories, such as terminal illness. A terminal illness is when death is expected within 6 months or less. Here, you're looking at certain aggressive forms of cancer, end-stage renal disease as examples of where it may make sense to avoid aggressive care, for these particular conditions and rather seek palliative care, very often in the form of not just comfort care in a hospital, but the utilization of a service known as hospice, which is most often applied in a residential setting, whether you live at home or in a long-term care setting, and is devoted to symptom management and quality of care for as long as you remain on service or alive. And I say on service or alive because ultimately you may find that you are in a situation where your health improves and you graduate from the need for hospice, which only comes into effect when a prognosis of 6 months or less is in place after a terminal diagnosis, I should say, is identified. An irreversible illness is a little bit different. Here we're talking about chronic treatment with no cure available. Examples for this could be ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson's, and such. And we've all got our own understanding of what heroic measures or quote unquote do everything means. It means focus on any aggressive treatment possible. These are all choices that you have a right to make and that you have a right to communicate effectively to people tasked with your care, whatever form it takes. You also have the right to adjust your parameters under which aggressive care versus palliative care may occur. And it's important to go ahead and to not just have a one-shot review of your goals and priorities, but to do that on a regular basis. Your goals are going to guide your care at different stages of your life. Those priorities are going to change, not only when it comes to your initial plan of care, but also as you experience a health status update, an advancing illness. You find yourself in a different setting in which care is received. Here we're talking not necessarily the difference between, say, a hospital and a step-down unit or a post-discharge inpatient setting, such as the skilled part of a nursing facility or a rehab hospital. Although, again, these could be where the setting of care defines goals and priorities, primarily discharge to ultimately wherever you consider home. But very often, we're talking about setting of care at the end of life. Do I want to age in place? Do I want to be in a long-term care facility? If I am enrolled in hospice care, do I qualify for it? And if so, do I wish to be placed in an inpatient unit versus receiving care at home? And all of these treatment preferences, like I said, they all are based on an evolving perspective on quality and quantity of life. So asking ourselves how goals of care should be described. I want to have the best care possible until the day I die. Well, that's a great statement, but does that mean aggressive only? Does that mean comfort only? Or are you talking about a continuum? I want to live meaningfully. Again, what does meaningful mean to you? Does it mean being able to run a triathlon, or does it mean living long enough to see the last season of a favorite television series? That's your call. I want to remain independent. Independence is a matter of interpretation, which is to say, do you wish to live on your own with no one helping you with your activities of daily living in your own home? Or do you wish to remain, to a certain extent, interdependent on family, friends, professionals who assist you with activities of daily living while aging in place? Or would you prefer that such assistance take place in a long-term care facility? Establishing boundaries. Boundaries on what? On the aggressive nature of care, on how much symptom management balances, say, your cognitive ability. Some medications can knock us for a loop. So where's the balance point where you can remain alert while also having your symptoms managed as best as possible? Where would you like to die? I would assume all of us would like to die with dignity, but the question is the most dignified place for you at home or in some type of institution? The choice is yours. Who gets to make these decisions besides you? Who gets the information besides you? And how do we talk about this information with family, friends, loved ones outside of your immediate circle, the people who you have just grown to part of your life and share intimate details with, but who may have no legal standing to influence decisions that you would otherwise make on your own? Well, all of them actually do come into play based on your values, your preferences, the clinical circumstances you find yourself in, and they're going to be influenced by the information that the interdisciplinary team, which includes the physician and all team members working with that physician, what they have to say about your condition and your likely prognosis. So, asking bonds of blood, bonds of friendship, bonds through, say, spiritual connection, talking about clergy now, or spiritual direction, or other people who help you live a holistic life. Asking all these layers of relationships to help you refine your life goals, your healthcare goals. The more communication, the better, while also recognizing that in the end, the choice is yours. Let me give an example. You've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and it appears that in a rapid period of time, and rapid here could be weeks or months, you are going to reach the point where you can no longer make decisions for yourself. You're going to have to rely on whoever you've designated as your healthcare proxy. So the question becomes, do I want to spend down my life savings with aggressive care measures as I move into mid to late stage Alzheimer's? Or do I want to see if palliative care measures are available? They're not going to end up lengthening my days, but perhaps I may end up, even though my quantity of days will be shorter, the end result of that may be that my savings will not be devoted entirely to my care, because ultimately I had a life goal of sending my children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren to college. Whatever the scenario may be, it's important to go ahead and to play it out in discussion and then reality check it if, God forbid, you're actually in the beginning of a real world experience. Now, I used Alzheimer's as an example because ultimately it's one of the more common places where we question or find ourselves needing to question whether someone retains decision-making capacity and competency. Now, this implies that they're able to understand and make their own decisions because they understand the information that's been put in front of them by providers, that they can use that information rationally. They can appreciate the consequences of whatever decisions they may make based on that information, and therefore come to a reasonable decision that works for them, and make sure that those choices are communicated so that if and or when hospitalization occurs, that team is well aware of the limits of aggressive care in your particular case. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time And in fact, we're devoting a session to legal matters when it comes to aging with grace. So I'm simply going to use the working definition today and describe it more in the subsequent session. Legal capacity / competency to occupy a particular status or relationship with another, to engage in a particular undertaking or transaction. Again, we're talking about legal terms of art, and you are absolutely obliged, because I am not a lawyer, to speak with legal experts about what these terms mean in your particular case or your family's particular case when it comes to defining capacity and competency. You're also going to want to discuss that on a medical level. If it's not an issue of, say, a deteriorating disease such as Alzheimer's, but you've had a psychotic break, God forbid, or you are in a diminished state of capacity or competency based on an injury, you need, ideally, your healthcare proxies in place making decisions on your behalf. Otherwise, you may need court action in order to have a guardian appointed to do so. Remember that ultimately, the written word trumps everything else, but that doesn't mean that everything else is useless. Verbal statements that you've made to others, an understanding of your general values and beliefs, an understanding of how you've lived your life, and in the end, what is in your best interest based on the state you find yourself in. These are going to be the prevailing factors that help make the best decisions about quality and quantity of days. If for any reason there is something which is unclear to people, this is the way in which clarity may be sought. Now, fully detailed advanced directives and narratives that have been witnessed and or notarized is the gold standard, which is why I encourage you, and again, we'll talk more about this in subsequent sessions, but I want you to be aware of things that you can actually accomplish on your own. And in 3 of the 4 cases that are listed here, what you need ultimately are 2 adult non-related witnesses who can attest to your making decisions with capacity and competency in mind. We're talking about who you designate as your medical, not durable, that requires a lawyer and a notary, but your medical power of attorney, to designating your decision maker or makers, primary, secondary, tertiary, go nuts. Just make sure that you have at least one person designated who has agreed to serve and understands, ideally in writing, but also through knowledge of you and your values and experiences, the circumstances under which you would want varying types of aggressive or varying types of comfort care. The living will, the directive to physicians that I mentioned before, to designate choices in case of a terminal or irreversible condition. Declaration for mental health treatment, to make decisions in advance about mental health treatment, what psychoactive medication or convulsive therapy you will consider acceptable, what emergency mental health treatment you will consider acceptable. Now, there are cases in which ultimately a mental health warrant is an example of where you can be involuntarily admitted to inpatient psychiatric care. But we're talking about situations where ultimately you are finding yourself preparing for, if you are dealing with serious mental health disorder, contingencies upon which people will decide what your care is based on your wishes when you still retain that legal and or medical competency capacity. The out-of-hospital do not resuscitate order, which is the only one of these documents that requires a physician's signature, is one which ultimately will let first responders know that you are not interested in the aggressive measures such as CPR, and we've described all the different things, the beyond compressions that are included under the umbrella of CPR, especially by first responders. You do not require them to perform it on you. Usually, the reason for that is that you are terminally ill. And if, in fact, that is a decision that you wish to make, then you ultimately want to have that posted someplace prominent, perhaps at the foot of your bed or above your bed or on your door. If you or a family member says, oh my goodness, we need some additional help because you are having a change in condition. That doesn't mean that you suddenly want aggressive care. You, if you have capacity or competency, can renounce that out-of-hospital DNR and say, do everything. But in the end, if you're consistent with that desire, then it needs to be placed someplace prominent in order to allow first responders to refrain from providing the most aggressive treatment upon their arrival at your residence, however that residence is defined. There are additional slides in here that I encourage you to look at in much greater detail on your own, such as if you are diagnosed with a serious or a life-limiting illness, making sure that you have spoken with your doctor at the very least about the following bullet points, such as sketching the usual trajectory of this illness. What do we hope treatment will do? How is that treatment going to make me feel? And what are the pros, cons, and alternatives of the proposed treatment? If I'm going to die from this disease, what is it going to feel like? And how can medicine ease my symptoms? If I move from aggressive to comfort care and opt for hospice services, are you going to still be able to serve as my doctor or part of a medical team? And if I do consider enrolling in a hospice as a form of palliative care, of comfort care, why would I do so? In other words, what do patients with my disease benefit most from by enrolling in hospice, and when? Very often, when we are fighting aggressive diseases, we enroll in hospice at a time where symptom management is not as effective because we have sought aggressive treatment for so long. This is not a judgment. This is an observation, because among the different skill sets that I have served as a hospice chaplain. And I want to assure you that there is no contest being waged except in your own mind and the minds of those who care for you the most as to when it is time to go ahead and to seek symptom management and move to comfort care versus aggressive care. And that includes asking yourself questions like, what activities or capacities make my life worth living? In other words, if I can't do them anymore, am I at a point where aggressive care ends? And if that's the case, what are my greatest fears and regrets? And how do I try to deal with those on a holistic level, with family, with friends, with clergy, with spiritual directors, anyone who can help me understand how to make sense of what is still bothering me emotionally, spiritually, mentally in my life? Given that my time may be short, how do I want to spend it? Do I want to go ahead and be able to take a trip away from my home? Or do I simply want to be able to watch football with some snacks and ice cream? That's your call. Our hope is that by doing all of this, you've left a good emotional legacy. You've enjoyed the time that you've had left, that whatever you define as an adventure, you've had it. And that whether it is physically, emotionally, financially, or beyond, you have left your loved ones prepared to move forward after your death, grieving, but able to recover and use that grief in a way that defines them as they move forward. So, know thyself. Think about your plans before they are needed. Formalize your directives and talk to the people most precious in your life, starting with family members and moving to all the circles I've mentioned earlier today. The resources for this particular slide deck are here on your screen. And this is a friendly reminder for those who joined us while in progress that you are going to receive a recording as well as a copy of these slides, that is to say, for today's session, those of you who are here or who registered and are watching it at your leisure. And if you have not yet registered for the other sessions, we encourage you to go to hhci.org, click on the events tab, and register for our subsequent Aging with Grace sessions. So that way you can receive recordings and slides as well. Now, I will let you know that if you are on hhci.org and you go to our resources tab, you can find recent recordings of different presentations. In fact, you'll find the previous season from the spring of 2023 of Aging with Grace. But again, we update the slide deck on a regular basis in order to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information about the different topics that each unit covers. So it's more of an and both suggestion, if you will, as far as making use of the resources that are in that tab on our website, as well as registering for current sessions that are being offered. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to just take a quick look to see. It does not appear that we have any questions. However, I will go ahead and say that, again, if you go to hhci.org, you will find under the About Us tab contact information for my boss, Dr. Peggy Dettermeyer, the director of HHCI CARES, and of course for me. Again, I'm Seth Stander, the community aging specialist for HHCI CARES. You will have our email, you will have our direct lines, and we are available for questions and for scheduling individual consultations throughout the typical work week. I see that there is one question here. Is there an online repository for advanced directives, etc.? And yes, take a look at the resources tab, and you're going to see there a list of at least one couple of different places where templates are available. In addition, based on whatever state you're in. Here in Texas, you'll want to go to Texas Health and Human Services. You will find state-written templates for various advanced directives as well. And in your particular state of residence, if you are not from Texas, the equivalent of Texas Health and Human Services is going to be the site for that as well. So again, our resources page, which you will receive, will have that link as well. But again, state agencies are a great place to start. I hope that everyone has a terrific week, and we will see you next week, and then following that, October 2nd and October 9th, for our remaining sessions of our fall 2023 Aging with Grace. Have a wonderful week, everyone. Take care.